Genesis chapter 9. Out of habit, I always reach for that bookmark, but you don't need it in the book of Genesis. It's just a few pages in. Genesis chapter 9. If you've been with us, you understand we've been talking about Noah and the flood, the great global flood that God instituted and used to hit the reset button on all of his creation, all living creatures. But you can even imagine the devastation it wreaked on the surface of the earth, and geographically, and rivers and lakes and even mountains were changed. The earth probably still bears those marks to some extent all over it even now. And God preserved a man named Noah and his family and a few animals, 2 of every species, that of the unclean animals, 7 of every clean animals. God preserved on a boat, a big wooden structure. And then the inhabitants of that boat, Noah and his family, were on it for quite some time, about a year, a little over a year. And they finally came to rest. After sending out birds to establish that the ground was dry enough for them to disembark the ark. That sounds pretty cool. I don't remember that. That's pretty good. And so that's where we find ourselves tonight. God has made a promise in chapter 8, but he's going to really reaffirm that promise and covenant in chapter 9. And we'll see in chapter 9 really 2 things I'm going to point out to you. You'll see them as we read it. But God's priority and God's promise are really illustrated for us in Genesis chapter 9 as we kind of zoom out and apply it to our own lives, and as we zoom in and see how it applied to Noah and his people. Interesting, the other day, we were walking, Eva and I, we'd been down to our little shop building, feeding the cat that lives in the shop building. We were walking back up to the house, just to the backyard, and out of the blue, and I mean out of the clear blue sky, she said, "You know, there's a lesson to be learned with Noah." And I said, she's 6, by the way. I said, oh, yeah? Well, yeah, what do you think? What do you think the lesson is? And she said, you know, God didn't forget about Noah, and he won't forget about us either. Isn't that? I guess you're right, babe. That's good. So I thought, wow. And then this morning, that happened yesterday, I believe. And then this morning, we were walking, same thing, feed the cat, walking back up to the house. And she said, "Did you tell Mom what I told you about Noah?" We'll be sure and tell Mom. So we had to tell Mom that about Noah as well. But we learned that last week, right? Genesis chapter 8. God remembered Noah and the inhabitants of the ark. And they land, and he remembers a covenant that he made with him. The covenant was that they would survive. Everything else would be wiped out, but they would survive. Well, God will make another covenant with his people. Starting in chapter 9, verse 1, it says this: God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Have we heard that before in our study of Genesis? This chapter is kind of remarkably similar to the first couple of chapters of Genesis, the creation. This is the recreation. Noah is the second Adam, if you will. And you see that, as you think about those themes in the book of Genesis, these are repeated here. Here's what it says: "The fear and terror of you will be in every living creature on earth, every bird of the sky, every creature that crawls on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. They are placed under your authority. Every creature that lives and moves will be food for you. As I gave the green plants, I have given you everything. However, you must not eat meat with its lifeblood in it. And I'll require a penalty for your lifeblood. I'll require it for any animal and for any human. If someone murders a fellow human, I'll require that person's life. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans his blood will be shed. For God made humans in his image. But you, be fruitful and multiply, and spread out over the earth and multiply on it." So we'll take a minute there, and I think we see here God's priorities, and those are that mankind is given this command to procreate, to perpetuate the species of human beings on planet Earth, to fill it. We're going to be told there, right at the end of that section, in verse 7, to spread out and fill this gigantic earth that we have been given. Now in chapter 11, there's a problem. Remember, they huddle up at a place called Shinar, and they start building a tower, the Tower of Babel. God has to confuse their language in order to get them to do what he says right here in chapter 9, to actually spread out and fill the earth. He tells them, first of all, once again, be fruitful, multiply, repopulate the earth. And then something's added here, and it's interesting to think about, were some of these things true before the flood, or were they not true before the flood and they are true now? He says that the fear and terror of you will be in every living creature on earth. Birds, creatures that crawl on the ground, the fish of the sea, they're all under your authority. So God, once again, places man in dominion over his created order and all his created species. Man is the pinnacle of his creation. Everything else is under man's authority. But here it adds that the fear and terror of you will be in every living creature. And you think about that even today. Have you ever seen, maybe at the circus or maybe on TV or in a foreign country, a man riding on the back of an elephant? That should not take place, should it? An elephant could end a person's life, just like that, without much hesitation. And yet, somehow, human beings are able to ride on the back of an elephant. That's crazy. Or, have you seen, and I'm sure you have, a child ride on a horse? 1,000-pound plus animal and a very small child directing that horse as it should go. You know, when I was living in Texas, Texas has a terrible feral hog problem, wild pig problem. And we lived pretty close to a lake, and that lake had a lot of public hunting area, 16,000 acres around it. And it was just overrun with these wild pigs. And people often will talk about these wild pigs being very dangerous to be around. It's really not true. Wild pigs are not that dangerous. As a matter of fact, we would hunt them on our hands and knees. We would crawl through the tall grass with a bow and arrow till we got within range, and we'd stand up, draw back, and shoot them. You say, but they could kill a person. They can kill a person, but almost always, if you encounter a wild pig, the wild pig will run away. Isn't this true? They'll just run away if you've ever been around them. Now, if you corner them, if they have no means of escape, if they have piglets, or something with them, you're in trouble at that point. You might be in trouble. You better run. Or the same thing is true about a bear in the wild. Oftentimes, a human being encounters a bear, the bear's going to take off unless there's a cub or something like that. Or how about a rattlesnake? You've heard somebody tell you this before, maybe when you were young. When you saw a snake, somebody would say, that snake's more afraid of you than you are of it. Which is hard for me to believe because I'm pretty afraid of rattlesnakes, okay? But it's true. If you let that snake, it'll just go away. It doesn't want to have any problems with you at all. And so we still see that today in our world, that God has put this fear or dread of humans into these animals. That's why we're able to pursue them. We're able to tame them. I've been told even animals like a rhinoceros that weigh 7 tons plus, when confronted by a human being, will often retreat rather than fight. A 200-pound person run off a 7-ton rhinoceros. God put this fear of terror into them. The same thing is true about fish in the sea. If you get your snorkel and you look into a tropical bit of ocean, maybe under it by a coral reef, you'll see all kinds of life. As soon as you dive in, they take off. And that's true. Birds of the sky, imagine if birds weren't afraid of us. We could walk outside and they might do the Disney thing, just land and whistle and stuff. But they generally don't. They have to be trained to do that, to overcome that, because God's put this fear or this terror in them. Not only does he put that fear or terror in them, he actually gives them to us. So we're to exercise authority over them, but now he gives them to us as food. Now, we don't know if the pre-flood world ate animals or not. We can't say that. But before the flood, man had just been given permission to eat vegetables. They'd just been given permission to eat fruit and things that grew from the ground, grain and so forth and so on. They were, in effect, vegetarians in as far as God had allowed them or commanded them to eat. Now, they were here for 1,500 years before the flood. Upward of maybe millions or billions of people existed before the flood. Okay? So I believe somebody at some point saw a cow and thought, I'm going to cook that and just see how it goes. I just have to imagine that it probably took place. But as far as permission, this is the first time God has said, hey, you can eat what grows from the ground, but you can also eat what crawls and walks on the ground and what flies in the air. That is now okay. And it says that everything that crawls. And if you think about that, we as Americans, we're pretty much ethnocentric. We're pretty kind of culturally biased. We just know about American culture, And so when you go to other countries, it's a lot of times big time culture shock because you see what people in other countries eat and how they exist. And I was reminded as I thought about that, every creature and everything that crawls, that can be food for you. I thought about that, everything. I went to, when I was in college, I went on a mission trip and I was in China. And the missionaries we were there with, China's kind of famous for wild cuisine. I mean, just kind of crazy stuff that they eat. And one of the missionaries that I was with spoke a little bit of the language, and I told him at the beginning of the year, I was more adventurous there then than I am now, for sure, with food. But I said, man, I want to eat some crazy stuff, because I wanted to come back with some wild stories, And I had a good friend of mine that had gone on a mission trip to Europe the summer before, and he had eaten donkey meat. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy, So I wanted to outdo him. And so we were in China, and man, I ate some crazy stuff. So one thing I did eat donkey meat, by the way. It was delicious. If you ever have an occasion to eat donkey meat, I recommend it. But I also ate a deep fried scorpion. That was probably the craziest thing that I ate. And it tasted awful. I don't recommend. There's a reason why we don't eat those. It was on a stick. There's a stick on it. Yeah, I crunched on it. It was awful. Ate a lot of things, including something that we see prohibited here. And usually what I would do is I would tell him, look, you order the craziest thing on the menu, and I'll eat it, and then you tell me what it is. Because I didn't want to know what it was before, because I probably wouldn't eat it. And so at one point I ate something, it was kind of like tofu. I thought it was tofu. And I was eating it, and it just tasted funny. And finally I asked him, what is this? And it was in a soup, it was in a broth, and it was these little cube things. And they were, it was a congealed duck blood soup. Tastes awful. Don't recommend that. Don't recommend. But of course, I like to duck hunt, and a new duck tasted pretty good. And I figured, well, they can probably really cook it over there. And so I asked at one point. I said, "Man, can you?" At one restaurant, I want to eat duck, and the language barrier didn't work out. I don't think, because he served us this dish, and I thought, what's that? And he goes, the duck. I don't think that's what that doesn't look like duck at all. He goes, no, it's the skin. It was duck skin. And it had little tortillas, and you put it on this little tortilla, and you rolled it up, and you dipped it in this sauce. Don't recommend it. But when you talk about the permission to eat every creature that lives and moves will be food for you, we have a very limited idea in our minds of what that means, right? There's just certain things we don't eat no matter what. Well, those prohibitions or those standards don't really exist in the minds of everybody globally. So when it says every creature that lives on food, lives and moves will be food for you, wow, that can really be true. Well, the one prohibition that we're told not to eat, every kind of meat's okay, and I want to be sure about and point this out. Every kind of meat here, according to this Noahic covenant in Genesis chapter 9, is okay. And then when we get into the New Testament, of course, we have the dietary law, which comes into play, the Mosaic law, which comes into play in the Old Testament. But then we get in the New Testament, we have a dream by Peter that helps us understand what's okay to eat and what's not okay to eat. He has a dream, and he sees a sheet descending from heaven. This is Acts chapter 11 has a sheet descending from heaven with all manner of animals and creatures on it. And God says to him, kill and eat. And Peter says, no, I'm not going to do that. Those are unclean animals. And God tells him, don't call unclean what I have made clean. So we understand the prohibitions against certain food are no longer in play. But not everybody understands that. Some groups still think it's pious or spiritual to only eat certain kinds of food and not to eat meat at all. The Seventh-day Adventists, by the way, are some of those people. If you ever had a friend that's a Seventh-day Adventist, they go to church on Saturday and they don't eat meat. That's what you probably know about them. And I have a friend, one friend that was a Seventh-day Adventist, and he was at dinner with another friend of ours, and she told me this later that he said, let me pray and bless the food. And so he went to pray and bless the food, and he said, God, we thank you for this food except for Mary's bacon. And so he wouldn't thank God that Mary got this bacon, and wouldn't thank her. Because they believe that eating meat, there's some standards that they still think are in place. But they're not. They're not. As a matter of fact, in Acts chapter 15, we have the Jerusalem Council, if you'll recall. And in Acts chapter 15, the problem was this. A bunch of Gentiles, non-Jews, were getting saved. They were embracing Christ and being saved. What part of the law do we give them? What part of the law do we give them? And the part of the law that they give them about food was only the prohibition against eating blood. That's the only part of the dietary law that the first century believers, the apostles, gave to the new Gentile believers who were coming to faith. So that's interesting, right? That goes all the way back to right here. This, what we call the Noahic covenant, the covenant God made with Noah in Genesis chapter 9. As a matter of fact, when I ate that congealed duck blood, after I ate it, the missionary I was with said, yeah, a lot of the believers here won't eat that. Because of what the Bible says about it. And I said, well, I didn't know there was a prohibition. I'm like, what does the Bible say about that? Well, that's what we're talking about. Genesis chapter 9. Lifeblood. Don't eat anything with the lifeblood still in it. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. But Pastor, a well-done steak is a sin. It has to be. Right? I like them rare, don't you? At least medium. Well, the truth is, and I had to Google this to make sure because I'd heard this to be true, but when an animal is butchered, a cow, for example, the blood is drained from that animal. So the red that remains in the skin is called myoglobin. It's actually not blood. It's something else. So you're good to go on the rare steaks. Sometimes you just research stuff enough to get enough information so you feel good about it. That's what I did on that one. So I want to keep eating those rare steaks. But why can't we eat something with blood? What's the problem with blood? What's the issue with eating blood? Well, the reason why is because it's in the name here, the lifeblood. Because the life is still in it. The meat is given to us as food. And that's what we're allowed to eat. Any animal, we're allowed to eat it. But the blood is symbolic of that animal's life. And so we're supposed to have a certain reverence for life. Now, as we see, and we'll get to it a little bit more, even animal life, we're supposed to have a certain reverence for it. We're not allowed to be complete savages that just kill everything with wanton disregard for the life that God gave it. God is the creator of that life. It's His life. We are allowed to take that for food, but we're not allowed to just wantonly waste the life. And so this prohibition against blood, I believe, is because of the symbol of the life that's in it. Leviticus chapter 17 talks about it. And you want to know one thing the Bible talks a lot about? Blood. Do a word study on blood in the Bible. The Bible talks about blood a lot. The sacrificial system, so forth, so on. Leviticus 17 says this, for the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have appointed it to you to make atonement on the altar for your lives, since it is the lifeblood that makes atonement. And so the sense is this, that God has set apart that life for sacrifice. The blood was symbolic of the life. The life was meant as a sacrifice. So the Old Testament system, the sacrificial system, they would put the blood, sprinkle the blood on the altar. It was symbolic of the life that was taken in order to make that atoning sacrifice. And we know that was all leading up to other blood that would be spilt, to a perfect sacrifice that would be made. And the Bible talks about the blood of Jesus a lot, that it was Jesus who shed His blood for us. He was sacrificed, his life and his lifeblood given as a perfect sacrifice for us. So, it's a symbol of life. Now, as I mentioned, priorities. God gives us one of his priorities here. And verse 6 is a very famous verse. One you probably know by heart. It says this: whoever sheds human blood, by humans, his blood will be shed. Or as I memorized it much younger, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made humans in his image. And so we're told then that there's something special about all life, even animal life, but there's something incredibly, exponentially more special about human life. And human life should not be taken except under very extreme circumstances. And one of the reasons why human life is allowed to be taken is if that person has taken another human life. In the Bible, there are a couple of exceptions to this that are fleshed out later on. Let me give them to you. So, in the context of a just and sanctioned war, it's okay for a person to take another person's life in the context of war. Now, that war has to be a just war, and it has to be a government-sanctioned war. You can't just, start your own war against your neighbor, Hatfield and McCoy style or whatever. But if it's an actual war and you're a soldier in that war, then the Bible demonstrates it's okay for you to take human life. Another situation would be in regard to self-defense. Self-defense is an okay means or okay situation for a person to take another person's life. Now you say, well, Pastor, what verse is that? Well, Exodus chapter 22 is an interesting verse. It says this in chapter 22, verses 2. It says 2 and 3. If a thief is caught in the act of breaking in and he is beaten to death, no one is guilty of bloodshed. But if this happens after sunrise, the householder is guilty of bloodshed. And so there's a principle there. The principle is what we now have as a legal doctrine called the Castle Doctrine. You might be familiar with the Castle Doctrine. It's sometimes talked about. You hear about it on the news and those kind of things. And it's this idea. If somebody comes into your house, particularly at night, you can assume that they're there to do you harm and you can defend yourself. And if in defending yourself you kill that person, you're not guilty of murder. That's even the law today here in Oklahoma. I don't think it's in every state in Oklahoma, but it is in this state. And then it goes on. It says, but if it happens after daylight, well, think about the world in which this was written in. You hear a thief break in the middle of the night, you're probably not going to stop to light a candle, right? You're going to grab the club or whatever you got, and you're going to go to war, all right, in your living room or wherever. Well, in that situation, if the sun has risen, the idea is that you would be able to defend yourself without killing this individual, without beating them completely to death. Now, we live in a world where we have guns. And so if a person shoots a person with another gun, they're probably going to die. That's usually how it works. And so that's why the law today says that if a person enters your house illegally, in Oklahoma, for example, and many other states, and you defend yourself, you're allowed to, and you're not going to be guilty of that person's murder. It's actually based off of this principle in Exodus, this idea of self-defense. Another exception to this idea of taking the life of another person would be capital punishment. I've heard people say that before to me. Well, how are we supposed to take another person's life for taking human life if we're not allowed to take human life? Well, capital punishment would be an exception to this rule as well. But capital punishment is not the role of an individual. It's the role of a government. Romans chapter 13, the whole chapter of Romans chapter 13 is interesting when it comes to a Christian's responsibility to obey the governing authorities. And it says that the government does not bear the sword in vain, but the government is God's servant for good. It bears a sword of authority to punish evil and to reward those who do good. And so, in that situation, those would be a couple exceptions. Here's another exception to that rule, and that's given in Scripture, and that is this. in the case of accidental death. There's a distinction made in the Old Testament law between, intentionally going out to kill somebody or even doing something violent that ends in someone's death and accidental death. And here's an example, is Exodus chapter 21. Listen to this example that's given. It says, when an ox gores a man or a woman to death, so there you go, ox goring a man or woman to death, the ox must be stoned, and its meat may not be eaten. But the ox's owner is innocent. However, if the ox was in the habit of goring, and its owner has been warned, yet has not restrained it, and it kills a man or woman, the ox must be stoned, and its owner must also be put to death. So this idea of negligent homicide or accidental death or intentional murder, there's distinctions of all these things. We have those in the law today, but they're also in the Old Testament law as well. So it says, because God made humans in his image, their life is not to be wasted. They're not to be killed. Their blood is not to be shed in violence. We would call that idea today the sanctity of human life. The sanctity of human life. There's something special about human life because we bear the image of God. Now, I think animal life is important. We shouldn't waste it unnecessarily, but it doesn't even come close to the importance of a human life because we're image bearers. And so, when we talk about the sanctity of life, we usually talk about the sin of abortion. And it's interesting because if you think about abortion in context with Genesis chapter 9, you see it violating two commands, don't you? The very first one is, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Abortion is the exact opposite of that, isn't it? Also, it's the shedding of human blood. It's killing a human being. I heard this statistic mentioned recently, and I had to go look it up because it was in an old book, and I had to go make sure it was accurate. Since the United States became a country, all the way back to the Revolutionary War, there's been 1.3 million military personnel killed in action in every war we've ever fought. The majority of them were the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. But, you think about Vietnam and Korea, the war on terror, all of them together, 1.3 million military personnel have died. In America, every year, we kill about 1 million babies in abortion clinics. In 50 years of Roe v. Wade being legal, we've killed over 50 million babies. It's insanity. It's insanity. And I'll go further because, this is my Wednesday night crowd. And I can be frank with you all. It's interesting to me, and I don't know why this is, but people who are generally against capital punishment are usually for abortion. Now, somebody please make that make sense to me because in my mind, I don't get that. How can you be for killing a child in its mother's womb, the epitome of innocence on planet Earth? If anything is innocent on planet Earth, it is a child in its mother's womb, and be against killing a serial killer on death row. How? It makes literally no sense to me. Life is to be protected. It's to be perpetuated. Is to be preserved. God has given us that instruction. A murderer, though, forfeits their life. When a person takes another person's life, they forfeit their own life. They have literally murdered themselves in the act of murdering someone else. And oftentimes people will argue with me about this capital punishment. I remember I took a liberal arts class in college, and the professor wanted to argue back and forth about capital punishment. And here's some of her arguments. Here's one. She said that, right now it costs more to keep somebody to kill somebody on death row, capital punishment, than it does to keep them in prison for life. So the cost was her first argument against capital punishment. And I thought that's interesting. Just because we're doing something wrong shouldn't be a good excuse to not do it. You know what I mean? Like, just do it right, and then you won't have that that problem. We have a kind of a convoluted system. Here's another one. This is a really common argument against capital punishment, and that's this. What about the wrongfully accused? The wrongfully accused. What do you say to a friend that you might have that would argue this with you when they would say that? What about people, because occasionally it happens, right? Somebody will be exonerated on death row, found out to be innocent after years on death row, and they're turned loose. Well, here's my argument. Well, listen, nowadays we have the due process of law. We have DNA and CSI and everything else, Surely, and I mean surely, we are better at determining who's guilty and who's not guilty of committing murder than they were in Noah's day when God gave this command. Surely we're better at it than they were then. Here's another argument. Well, it doesn't deter crime. People still commit murders, even though we give them the death penalty. Okay? So by that standard of thinking, we should get rid of every law because punishment doesn't deter crime. I mean, if you have possession of drugs, you go to jail. Well, people still possess drugs, right? I mean, it doesn't stop them. Don't break the speed limit. If you break the speed limit, what happens? You get a speeding ticket. How many of you have gotten a speeding ticket and you still speed? Okay, right? Let's all do the Baptist. This is right here, right? Right? Okay. That's not the point. The point is not only to deter crime. We hope it deters crime, but the truth is, the point is to punish what is wrong, to stand up for what is right and what is wrong in our society in order to have a just society. So we're told that if a person sheds human blood, their blood should be shed. Remember, we've had a few murderers already in the story of human beings that we know of. We had Cain killing Abel, and then we had Lamech, a descendant of Cain, who killed multiple people. We don't know how many people. He killed at least 2. He brags about killing people. And then in chapter 6, as God is talking about how bad the world is, he said it's full of violence. The world was full of violence. So we can only imagine the kind of murder that was taking place in our depraved pre-flood world where there was only one person on planet Earth at that time who worshiped God, Noah and his family. Imagine how corrupt the world and imagine how much murder was taking place on planet Earth. Look, it says that. So, verse 5, it says that if an animal kills a human, if any animal kills a human, I'll require blood from it. If a person kills one, I'll require their life for it. So that's God's priority then is human life. It's special. It's special. Go on, verse 8 says this, Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, Understand that I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, birds, livestock, and wildlife of the earth that are with you, and animals of the earth that came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again will every creature be wiped out by flood waters. There will never again be a flood to destroy the earth. This is a sign of the covenant I'm making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all future generations. Let's talk about the covenant just a second. So God gives what we call the Noahic covenant. All right, there's the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the Old Covenant, and the New Covenant, Mosaic covenant, which is Old Covenant, and then the New Covenant we often talk about throughout the Scriptures. This is the Noahic covenant. Here are the terms. The terms are God's promise, primarily, that he will not again destroy the whole earth like he did the first time. There's covenant prohibitions in this covenant. Don't eat blood. Don't kill people. Those are the covenant prohibitions. And there's a sign of the covenant. The sign of the covenant is a sign of the Old Covenant, to give you an example, was circumcision. That was a sign of the Mosaic covenant, the Old Covenant. The sign of the New Covenant is baptism. That's the sign of the New Covenant. Now, the sign of the Noahic covenant is a bow, a rainbow. Verse 13, God's promise. I have placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I form clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature. The bow will be in the clouds, and I will look at it and remember the permanent covenant between God and all living creatures on earth. God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and every creature on earth." So we're told this is a permanent covenant. It's a covenant, really one-sided covenant. God's making this covenant. It's not a conditional covenant. That would be the Mosaic covenant. Strict obedience to the law equals God's favor. That's the Old Testament in a nutshell. Even the new covenant, faith in Christ, God promises to save us and also in heaven, or to give us heaven, but also inhabit our bodies through the Holy Spirit as well. That would be the new covenant. Those are also conditional covenants. This is not. This is a permanent covenant between God and who? All people, all living creatures, all future generations. God making this promise. Over and over it says this. Now I want you to think about this. If you had been on the ark, if you had ridden that boat for a year in the floodwaters, and you got out and you saw a completely changed landscape like you'd never seen before. Imagine in your mind the first time after the flood that it started to rain. Exactly, right? Oh my, you're like, okay, is it done yet? Is it done yet? How about now? Is that a puddle? Is that a puddle? That puddle's getting bigger, right? I mean, you would be concerned. So God makes this promise. He makes a promise. I'm not going to destroy the earth again. But notice, he's specific. I'm not going to destroy it again with water, with flood water. He is going to destroy it again. 2 Peter tells us it'll be with fire. Revelation chapter 20 tells us there'll be a new heaven and a new earth he will create. The old heaven, the old earth will pass away. And so God will destroy it, but not with floodwaters. He makes that promise to every future generation. So you don't have to worry if God is going to do this again. God is going to establish the earth and human beings on earth and every living creature so they won't be again wiped out completely. And he gives us a sign, and the sign is a bow or a rainbow. A rainbow. Let me ask you this question. How do you react when you see a rainbow? Today, you're a grown adult, every one of you, and you're driving down the street after the rain showers come, and you see a rainbow. What do? Whoa, right? Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing we still do that? We still marvel at this promise that God has given us. We still try to take out our phone, even though we're driving, and we know we shouldn't, and we're trying to take a picture, we send it to somebody. Wow, a rainbow, it's incredible. It's incredible. We still marvel at that beautiful promise of God. And that's what we understand it to be. God's promise. Now, it breaks my heart that I have to one day have a conversation with my little girl that loves rainbows and tell her that there are people who take that beautiful promise of God and they pervert it to endorse a certain kind of sin. And I'm dreading that day that I have to explain that we see rainbow flags hanging and it's not what she thinks it is. And isn't it a bit ironic that it's that symbol from the Bible that they take? When God destroyed planet Earth because of man's wickedness and made a promise that he wouldn't do it again. It's a picture of a promise made after he destroyed the world for wickedness and sinfulness. It's that symbol. Somebody should have read their Bible before they picked up on that particular symbol, because it's a sign of God's promise after he destroyed the world that he wasn't going to do it again. Isn't that ironic? Well, let me give you something else to think about here, and I'll turn you loose. Think about this for a moment. In the rest of the Bible, commentators almost universally, you read a commentary on this section, they almost all point this out. That word bow is used from here on to refer to a different kind of bow. A bow like a bow and arrow, or a battle bow, the archer's bow. And so think about that, if you will. If God, in the flood, in judgment, drew back his bow, pointed at the earth and fired it, and destroyed every living creature on earth. That's what the flood was. But now he has taken that bow and he's hung it up in the clouds. And it's no longer pointed at the earth. The earth is no longer in danger. It's now pointed up where? It's pointed up. It's safe. The business end of the bow is pointed north, right? It's pointed away from us. God's promise not to destroy mankind, not to destroy the earth, not to destroy the living creatures ever again on earth. It's part of his covenant. Covenants have terms. Covenants have prohibitions oftentimes, and covenants often have signs. This is the sign of God's covenant in Genesis chapter 9. It's that promise, that rainbow in the sky. The terms, that he would not destroy the earth again, especially not with water. And it's a promise between every living creature ever. And this is a promise made before the old covenant. Here, I told you I'd let you go. Let me do that. I'll get going again. So we'll end on that. But God is faithful. He's kept that promise. Since this happened, probably 4,500 years ago, we've not had another global flood, have we? He said he won't do it, and he won't. Over and over you'll find this. God makes a promise. He keeps it. He always keeps it. You can be sure that God is faithful to keep his promises. And so we ought to be faithful in the things he's asked us to do. We ought to understand that it was sin and wickedness that caused the destruction of the earth. We ought to pursue righteousness. We ought to love life and preserve it. These are the things I think we learn from Genesis chapter 9.